Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome to this Oncrawl webinar called A Data-Driven Method to Effectively Migrate to HTTPS from HTTP. We wanted to put this together because there's so many different issues that I run into that that I actually end up seeing all the time when I'm doing, when I'm doing SEO audits or just working on websites, and it really comes down also to issues that sites have with search engine rankings, and that what we end up having is really issues when migrations have happened, when people are moving essentially URLs, and you're moving your site from one set of pages, which is something like http:// www.oncrawl.com, and you're moving to HTTPS. Those are actually two different URLs. They're two different pages seen by the search engines, and they're different. You type them in the browser, and they're separate. They're separate URLs. So we have to actually go through and make sure that all the technical things and all the indications are set up properly, so that we move and we basically move smoothly from one set of URLs to the other. So in this particular, I wrote a while back. I wrote a fairly lengthy article about basically ensuring that your domain migration goes smoothly. In this particular webinar today, we're going to talk basically kind of three different scenarios, if you will. One that's very common, which is moving from HTTP to HTTPS, which is very common nowadays and highly recommended by me and search engines and everyone now. But also, what if you were to move from one domain name to another domain name? For example, what if you find a better domain name? If you find a better domain that is perhaps it's shorter, or you move to one of these new GTLD domain names. Talk a little bit about moving from one domain name to another to make sure that you don't lose rankings. And the other issue is with the migration, it doesn't happen very often, but companies do consolidate. So you do consolidate from one particular domain name. Maybe there's two companies that merge, or you have several different websites now, or different domain names, and you want to just move everything to one particular main domain name. In that case, there's a lot of different considerations there. So in all of these cases, you need a good crawler, and you need something like Oncrawl to be able to figure out all of the pages on the site and have a really good indication of, basically, we end up with a list of all the possible URLs that have ever existed on that domain name. And so the process is really to, number one is, before you move from HTTP to HTTPS, or from one domain to another, or consolidate, we need a good crawler. We need that data. We need the really good, we need that particular data in order to ensure that that we can check stuff later. So Oncrawl works well, and for me in particular, is because we're combining a lot of different data sets. We're combining, number one, we're combining Google Analytics data. We're combining as well as Google Search Console data, log file data, and data from an actual crawl, starting ideally, typically from the home page of the site. There's all sorts of different URLs that we can come up with and pages with those and with that particular data. And for example, there could be one particular issue where you have PDF files and on your website, and those are going to only really show up. You'll find those through a crawl, but you'll also find them in log file data. Google Analytics data does not show any visitors or traffic to a PDF file. So you wouldn't, if you're just relying on Google Analytics data, you might not know that. So basically, what we want to first do in this process is kind of understand a little bit why we would want to move to HTTPS. Basically, let's start with HTTP to HTTPS. It's very common. We've heard that we need to move a site from HTTP to HTTPS, and so basically, we want to make sure that it's secure and our websites are secure now. That's changed over the years. HTTPS was typically just for e-commerce websites and typically sharing your or entering your credit card information, and to make sure that that data that travels over the web is secure. However, at the same time, now we've gone into a situation where we've got a lot of privacy issues and so forth, and there are some issues. If you are a publisher and you run ads on your website, you will want to make sure you're all fully HTTPS, because there can be issues with rogue ad networks and JavaScript running that would theoretically run your site that could lead to denial of service attacks and so forth and other issues. We can.
I'm going to pause for just a second because we have a slight technical issue. We're unable to see your screen at the moment. Are you able to share it, or do you want me to take over? There you go. Okay.
Okay.
Great. Thanks.
Sure. So basically, we understand that nowadays, whether you're using Google Chrome, whether you're using Firefox, any different browsers, you're going to get a warning. Basically, the visitors are going to get a warning if the page is not actually secure. And so we would do, and HTTPS is a search engine ranking factor. Google in particular has come out and said that they do want to make sure that we move to HTTPS, and when you do move, you're not going to suffer any rankings and issues or so forth, as long as we go and do this smoothly. There are a couple of different types of SSL certificates in particular. Basically, you can understand, the high level of it is that there's free SSL certificates and there are paid certificates that you have to pay for. And it basically comes down to the level of security of that certificate. Basically, you can install the certificate yourself. You can typically have your web host install it, or you can actually use a CDN like Cloudflare, and then there are certain services that provide free certificates. It really comes down to the fact that as long as it's the URL is HTTPS and it is secure, the actual type of certificate, when it comes down to search engine rankings and Google, they don't really necessarily care whether it's a paid certificate or whether it's you're using a service like Cloudflare for it, or whether you're paying $100 a year or getting it for free. That's really not the issue as far as when it comes to search engines and rankings. So I'm going to go through the steps in particular. And first, for moving from HTTP to HTTPS. So basically, I want to say that before you do anything, you want to make a backup of your site. Typically people use WordPress. cPanel is a fairly an option that a lot of people use. For typical small business sites, and with WordPress. Some larger sites, do use WordPress as well. But basically, you want to make a backup of the site and verify that you have a backup before you make any changes. The first thing I do actually is go ahead and crawl the site using Oncrawl. And so basically, if we look at Oncrawl in particular, I've set up a crawl, and this is a typical, the results of a typical crawl. And typically, if you go and look at, the Data Explorer, you will see that, that the crawl occurred. And typically beforehand, you will see, all HTTP URLs. That's typical. This is a crawl that occurred after I had moved to HTTPS, but typically you will see, in the Data Explorer, you'll see that you will see HTTP URLs. So we have a backup. Basically, you want to decide first whether or not what type of certificate you want to install on the site, and figure out how you're going to get that installed. If you are pretty technical, and actually I'm pretty technical myself, but I don't really want to spend an hour or two figuring out how to install a certificate on my site. So it was just easier for me to pay my web host $30 a year for them to install it, and that's the way it works. For other sites that I have that are essentially just either landing pages or just for different domain names I own, I did want to move those to HTTPS. So I use the Cloudflare option, and they essentially use a shared certificate. You share a certificate with a bunch of other different domain names that are listed on the same certificate, but it works, and it works, so that it is HTTPS versus HTTP. Basically, a couple things. I'm going to concentrate, show a little bit, some things about. Once we have a backup of the site, I'm going to look at my WordPress settings, and this is under general settings and then general. And essentially, this is the place where your WordPress URL, the address and the site address. Those are, that's the place where you're going to basically change that to HTTPS versus where it was HTTP before. And certainly, if you have more than one installation of WordPress on your site, for example, you might have one for the home page, one for your blog. You might actually have one for a different installation for a subdomain. So I've seen those. So basically, there may be more than one place you need to change this, but essentially, this is for a basic WordPress site. You would change this once the certificate is installed. You'll probably will have to log in again and so forth. So basically, at this point, the other, WordPress should change a lot of these settings. You can verify. The other place to look is I use the Yoast SEO plugin. So you can actually look in Yoast, and under the tools, and this file editor actually allows you to look at the htaccess file. So essentially what happens is whenever a request is made for HTTP, for example, on your website, there's a rule that basically says if HTTP is requested, then basically redirect everything to HTTPS. And there's a few lines here basically in this htaccess file. That's done. Your web host might change that. for you when they install a certificate. Depends on how, what they do as far as, their managed hosting goes. Your, WordPress actually may, there are some HTTPS plugins that you can look at that actually, will force, the HTTPS to be used. Essentially, the biggest problem I see, though, is that when it comes down to, issues, is that when, once you move to HTTPS, the actual site itself, that's, you're not really done. And even though it's, you're not using HTTPS, you actually have to go in and change the site itself and make sure that everything that is referenced on the site is now pointing to HTTPS rather than HTTP. And so a typical scenario would be that is when you have an internal link on your site. When you actually have an internal link, you're linking from one page to another page. And so basically you want to make sure that when you link or click on a link or mouse over a link on your site, that you're actually pointing to the HTTPS version rather than HTTP. Even though I just showed you the htaccess file, that actually will redirect visitors from an HTTP link to an HTTPS. You need to go internally on the site and make sure that you've actually made those changes so that when Oncrawl crawls and goes from page one to another and follows links on the site, that they don't encounter any redirects. And so basically you have control over your site. And so there are tools. With WordPress, the Better Search and Replace tool is essentially you are going to search for everything on the site, and where where actually the HTTP version exists, and you're going to replace it with HTTPS. This actually tool will search all of the, if you highlight them all, it will search all of the internal issues, or well, it'll fix all these internal issues essentially. So what you're going to do is you're going to actually do a search, and wherever HTTP, your domain.com is mentioned, and anywhere, whether it's basically anywhere in the code. So if it's mentioned, as an image, or as an internal link, or as it mentions or refers to a script, .css file or a .js file or something like that, that it'll replace. So every version of that particular URL, a HTTP version will replace with HTTPS. You can actually do a dry run and figure out how many changes are needed, and then you can just make the changes. Typically you would want to make a backup and basically make sure that you spell everything correctly, because if you misspell it, you're doing a search and replace. So this can definitely be a way you can screw up your site pretty quickly, but it is a very fast, effective way to do it. So you use this particular plugin, the Better Search and Replace, do the search and replace, and this will take care of everything. And then again, you want to actually then go back and run another crawl of the site and verify that there are not any redirects. And when you actually look at the crawl report, you actually want to see whether or not there are any, look at the status codes. And this particular site, there's luckily there aren't, there actually, let's see, there are a fair amount of redirects. And so you want to actually look at the status codes and make sure that that there are not any redirects that are happening. This was a crawl that I did that was a list of URLs. And so what I did is what I crawled, I put in, rather than having the crawler go from page to page, I used the URL tool with Oncrawl, and this is the results of, I checked basically to make sure that all of the redirects from HTTP to HTTPS were in place. And so this is basically the results of that. And I used all the old URLs with HTTP to make sure that they are redirecting properly. Let's see. Also, typical crawls, you can actually see, whether or not there are 404s and 301s. One of the issues is that you can actually run into is, definitely worth mentioning, is that when you're moving, you want to make sure that you don't have a redirect chain. And we've talked about, Oncrawl's talked about a little bit in some other articles and posts recently. But basically, when you request or type in your browser HTTP:// without the www, and you actually go to HTTP:// oncrawl.com, that actually should actually redirect. The HTTP version should redirect to the HTTPS www version. It should, so it should not redirect from HTTP to HTTP www to HTTP www or HTTPS www. There would be several different versions redirecting. What we want is a version where when we type in HTTP://oncrawl.com, that redirects to the final version, which would be the HTTPS www. Once we've crawled and actually, we're pretty confident that we've done the better search and replace. We've crawled the site. We're not seeing any kind of, any issues. Want to kind of spot check the site. Go to the home page. Make sure the lock symbol is showing up. And then also you want to go to some internal pages and click around the site and kind of manually click around and make sure that you always have a broken lock symbol, or that you have a lock symbol on every page. You don't have a broken lock symbol. I had somebody call me out of the blue and said their rankings were, had all of a sudden just disappeared the past couple of days, and it turns out they had moved from HTTP to HTTPS, and only their home page had a lock symbol, and all the interior pages did not, and the interior pages, internal pages, had a broken lock symbol. Because they were loading, images and they sent, on HTTP versus HTTPS. So that was actually just by visiting the site, I was able to find and tell them that, that they had an issue. Another area to look at, basically, once you've looked at that, another area would be the Google Analytics settings. So basically, you'd want to go to Google Analytics, and in the admin section, you'd want to tell Google that this is now HTTPS as well. Other areas, think about links to your site, any kind of your email signatures, your social profiles, any links that you control. Basically, they're pointing. We want to point them to the HTTPS version of your homepage. not HTTP, because you're basically wanting to show, Google and, everybody else that you're now HTTPS. And the more you can show them, the better, and the quicker everything will kind of switch over, if you will, especially in the search results. It's definitely worth it to verify all the different versions of your site with Google Search Console and Bing Webmaster Tools. Basically, when I say all versions, there's basically an HTTP : version. There's an HTTP www version. There's actually HTTPS : and then there's also an HTTPS : www. So there's 4 different versions right there. The HTTP versions with and without www, and then you also have the HTTPS versions that are with and without www in those. There actually is particularly, I have seen sites that had in search results, they actually had 6 or 8 different versions. So they had subdomains with the www and subdomains without indexed, and same thing with HTTP and HTTPS. So you can actually get subdomains indexed and with and without. Essentially, we want those 301 redirects set up properly to take care of that. So basically, the Google Search Console verifying all the different versions. Once you put those in there, and if you have the 301 redirect set up properly, those other versions will verify, without a problem. It's just a click, but it actually is important to go and see in Google Search Console to actually verify that you have, those particular versions. And if you go to have all those different versions verified, what you'll see is in this particular in the performance report and the old search analytics, which now redirected to the performance report, you'll actually end up seeing that on the HTTP version, the non SSL version, the one you're redirecting away from, that traffic actually should be going down, and and over time, and you should probably that is normal for HTTP version, the traffic in here to go down. At the same time, the HTTPS version should be going up. And if you have a case where a month or two after, or even a week or two after you've moved, and the HTTP version is not going down as far as traffic goes, it's not going down, then that there's still clicks and rankings on the HTTP version. So there might be an issue there that you need to take a look at. So basically, that's why you would want to verify all those different versions. And of course, there are third-party tools at the same time worth mentioning. Different server header checks. So you can just do a search for a server header check, and you can put in the URL, and you want to make sure that actually you do see a status in that server header that there is a 301 moved permanently from the HTTP version to the HTTPS version as well. And that's basically as long as you have those 301 redirects in place, that will actually it is set up properly. Same thing with I'll talk in a few minutes about moving actually from one particular domain name to another, but those 301 redirects are actually need to be in place basically permanently from now on. There are going to be if you've had your website up and running for a certain period, even for a few months before you move, there are links from other websites pointing to your HTTP version, and as those, as long as you have that redirect in place from HTTP to HTTPS, there's not going to be really any problem with rankings or traffic and so forth to the site. Really, the issue is that that Google is, the search engines are crawling other websites. They see a link to your site, they will go to the HTTP version, and then then they want to be redirected with a 301 redirect to the HTTPS version. That's really the concept there, is that even 3 years down the road, that somebody still has a website linking to you, but they're linking to the HTTP version, you still want those redirects in place, and because you do want to actually get the credit for those links. There is I have run into issues where looking at the HTTP versus HTTPS version, sometimes the search engines will hold on for a while. They'll hold on with the HTTP version, and so if you do a site colon domain.com, you'll see, ideally you'll see all HTTPS URLs. If they're if Google still is showing an HTTP URL of yours, you can use the Google Fetch and Render tool and actually make and tell them to crawl if there are certain URLs that that are ranking well, but you want to make sure that Google moves to the HTTPS. You can actually ask them to crawl those particular pages. There is a limit with the Google Fetch and Render tool, but essentially you do want to have them to crawl. As far as crawling goes, also another check would be to look at your any sitemaps that you actually have. So basically any sitemap, sitemap.xml, the Yoast plugin actually creates several different sitemap files. So category sitemaps, posts and pages, and the sitemap index. You'll want to make sure that those are referencing your HTTPS version. Most cases, when if you do have WordPress and the Yoast SEO plugin or something like that, typically that's not a problem. What I do run into with large scale enterprise sites, that sometimes those XML sitemaps are automatically generated, or sometimes they're kind of manually generated, and that's you can run into issues with the sitemap file actually still referencing HTTP versus HTTPS. So basically, at this point, I can kind of move on to the next phase of this, which would be with migrating from HTTP to HTTPS. I guess the next phase would actually be to move on to talk about moving from one domain name to another. And certainly any HTTP or HTTPS migration questions, we're going to have a time for questions at the end of this, where you can ask some questions. But I'm going to move on to basically steps for migrating to a new domain. There's not really, it's essentially the same concept from moving from one particular domain name to another, and essentially, we still start with a crawl report. We still start with crawling the site and recording everything. This is actually a good time to consider when you are moving from one particular domain name to another. It's a good time to make sure a couple of things. First thing is, whether or not you actually need to maybe change web hosts. When if you have a particular domain and website on one particular server, consider whether or not maybe upgrading your server, or actually sometimes even downgrading and moving to a different server might be while you're going through this process, might be a good time to actually do that as well, because you're actually essentially you have content on one domain name, and you're moving that content to another domain name. So there's so that's an option. And considering that you actually still, I talked about redirects, I talked about having those redirects in place. So especially when you move from one domain name to another, you're going to need those redirects in place. So you're going to actually testing or some way the old domain name to still have those redirects in place to tell visitors, humans and the search engines, that you've moved to another domain name. So those, even 3, 4, 5, 10 years down the road, you still need those redirects in place so that you can either have those with that old domain, you can actually have those redirects on the old on the old on the old server, which you won't need as much hosting for that, but you'll because you're not really hosting the files anymore, you're just hosting a list of redirects. That can be also done from the registrar level, but typically it's better to have actually old hosting set up or another hosting set up, so that you can redirect one particular page to another particular page. And sometimes it's not actually a one-to-one redirect. You're not actually redirecting the same exact page to another page. Sometimes you might remove some content at the same time. So essentially what we want to do is consider that. There's two things. Consider first whether or not you need hosting. The second issue is the new domain that you're moving to. We can get into issues with links. This new domain that you're moving to, in that particular case, anything that you're combining from the old domain to the new domain, when you move, the new domain that you're moving to, if that domain has bad links, or it has an issue or any issues, then you're actually you're combining the old domain name with it, and you can run into issues. So make sure that the domain name that you're moving to, review the links. Use Majestic, Hrefs. SEMrush will allow you to see links to a domain name. I prefer Majestic. Majestic actually also integrates here with Oncrawl, and so you can pull that particular data, and actually see if there are any issues. But ideally, two things. You'll have verify both domain names. So if you can't have a new domain name, the old domain name, also look at the links. And so basically, even though you haven't moved yet to the new domain name, you can actually verify that domain name as long as you own it. You can verify it in Google Search Console and look at the links to make sure everything is clean. I mentioned new hosting for a new server. So basically, you want to crawl the site. Essentially with log files, Google Analytics, Google Search Console, and the link data. We want to get all of the possible URLs that are available that ever existed or were requested, in log files, in Google Analytics, Search Console, and so forth. We want to preserve that data and that list. We want to verify all the versions of all the different domain names. So basically, the same. You're going to have two domains. You're going to have HTTP:// and then you can have the www with that version plus the www version. The same with HTTPS and HTTP. So you're going to have essentially 4 versions for one domain and 4 versions for the new one as well. So you want to verify all those different versions. The same, so once you're sure to move, there's two ways to do it. I mean, you can literally go into your, talk to your, current web host and have them literally just change the domain name, tell them you're changing. But ideally, you would, what you would probably want to do, if a case where you have, things like, cPanel and WordPress, I typically like to have still the old of the domain plus also a new version on that same server. And so, and actually I am, basically taking a backup of the old domain and importing the backup into the new hosting on the new domain, and making sure that the new domain, the hosting and everything and the site is working properly before actually, set up the redirects. Once those are set up, what we've done is, setting those up relies kind of on Oncrawl's data, because we're actually looking at the old URLs and making sure that we're, that particular list from, of URLs from, for example, from the Data Explorer, that those particular, 16,000 pages that we know about are being redirected. It's a little easier, to set up with the htaccess file, basically to set up the redirects from the old domain name to the new one. That's assuming that you would essentially have and keep hosting for the old domain name and the new one. Once those redirects are set in place, I would actually crawl again to make sure that, that using that list mode, that the redirects are actually, happening. That was a case where when I did that with that particular, I checked for 426 pages to make sure they were redirecting properly, and the only one that wasn't was just a few pages. One page was the home page, which was typical, because that doesn't redirect. So that particular case, I checked, and in this crawl we checked, I checked all the URLs from that URL list that I had created before. I want to mention the Google, let's see, the Google change of address, and that I have not been able to find that. I know that is, google.com/webmaster/tool/change-address. That particular tool, in this case, we want to actually set it up. We need the old version. We need both versions, essentially, of. We need both versions verified in Google Search Console in this case. What we need is the old version plus a new version. So when we use this particular tool, you're actually going to the current site. And if I was going to move from billhartzer.com to, say, hartzer.com, that change of address tool is still here in the this gear icon. So basically what we're doing is we're officially verifying that we own both sites, and we're actually going to basically go to the old site, and we'll want to do this with all versions. Go to the old site and then pick the new site from your list of that you verified, and then tell them they will check that the homepage redirects, and it will actually, and there will be a checkbox, and there will actually be also a, that that the verification that that you own both sites, that that those are still in place, and click confirm and submit. And basically, this case is that you're officially telling Google that you are changing from one domain to another. I do believe that if you have verified both sites and you use this change of address tool, most likely, and I have not verified this with any reps from Google like John Mueller or anybody, but I'm assuming that if you have verified both versions, that they will most likely, using this tool, they will most likely change or give you credit, from with all the links from the old site to the new site. If you don't use this verification, the change of address tool, they probably may or may not pass all the link juice or all the link credit through the 301 redirects from the old site to the new site. This is probably and obviously you want to check and make sure that those 301 redirects are in place. I think we're running just about out of time. I'm going to throw it back and see if we have any questions about either migrating from HTTP to HTTPS, or specifically anything related to migrating from one domain name to another.
Okay, I think we do have a few questions here. One is,
okay.
Are there any tips you would recommend for extra large websites with hundreds of thousands of pages?
So any tips from, so I'm going to repeat the question. So any tips from migrating, large sites from to HTTPS? In particular, I think that there, one of the, it depends on, how the site is built and as far as, technically how the site is built. I think that there's, you get to, with large sites, there are certain areas that, like, certain subdomains, and, certain subdomains may be hosted on certain servers. I think you don't necessarily have to migrate everything over to HTTPS all at once. I think you can actually, you can do it in stages. You can, if you have a really extensive, help section that's on one particular server, and we're dealing with that, you're dealing with that particular server. That might be a project in itself, just to get those, get everything internally, all the links fixed and all, all of that, and moved over, so that it's moved over to HTTPS. You don't necessarily have to have all parts of the site, all migrated at one time. I think that, when you get into large sites in particular situations, it does make sense to, to move certain parts of the site to HTTPS, rather than, and kind of do it as you can, but at the same time, do realize that, there are, internally, you've got to change resources and update pages. You've got to set up the redirects. You've got to, then test. The domain itself, typically, if you get a certificate for the one domain name, you don't have to actually get a certificate, as I understand. That's good for the whole domain name. That doesn't mean that you have to, once you've installed HTTP, the certificate on the domain, that doesn't mean you have to, move everything to HTTPS at that time. It is there, and if a HTTPS URL is requested, it'll work. But again, I think that just like any migration project, do it in sections and pieces.
Great, thanks, Bill. We have another question from Simon. He says, I always use a CDN to manage the actual DNS changes, which means he can switch back and forth easily and quickly. Are there any other techniques you would recommend?
I think that sure. I mean, use the CDN. I mean, I do use Cloudflare, which is CDN, and I manage the DNS changes there. With certainly that would I don't think there's any particular any particular techniques there. What I do prefer to do is once I have made the decision that I'm moving everything over to HTTPS and that there really shouldn't be anything else left out. If I'm using something like Cloudflare, I'm going to, they have an option, the option to basically force with the CDN to basically force HTTPS on everything, and it will also check, to make sure that and there are also some settings there in particular with to make sure that this domain or everything is HSTS compliant. And so there is, worth mentioning, there is a site that is a HSTS pre-check, and essentially there is a preload list for Google Chrome that you can get your domain on. So essentially, if you have everything on the CDN and everything set up for HSTS, you can actually get on the Google Chrome preload list, and there's a site, I believe it's hstspreload.org, and you can actually use that. You put in your URL, and it will check to make sure that everything qualifies. And if it does qualify, then at that point you can submit it. And essentially, your domain is actually hard coded into Google Chrome, and that means that any request in Google Chrome that is HTTP will actually only load your domain name on HTTPS, and it's kind of it bypasses HTTP. I don't know if that is if that's a trust signal or not, but I personally know I've moved everything over to HTTPS now for this particular domain, so why not get it on that particular the preload list for Google Chrome?
Bill, next question we have: do I need to resubmit a sitemap to search engines, for example, after migrating from one domain to another, from HTTP to HTTPS?
Sure. So I wouldn't necessarily. So you're going to have two things. You're going to have so you're moving from one domain name to another. What I do recommend is you actually have the old sitemap that has all of the old URLs. That actually should be still available to that should be still available to the old in the old Google Search Console, and because Google will then crawl those URLs on the old domain, and they'll use that sitemap file. What's good to know is that they'll crawl those, and then that will help them realize that particular page from the old domain is now being redirected to the new domain. It's just it gives them more information, and it helps them helps them crawl a little faster, and realize that that redirect is in place. And so typically the old domain would have the old sitemap in that XML sitemap, and then the new domain would actually have also the new the new pages on the new domain.
Okay, great. Thanks for that answer. You mentioned using the change of address tool to tell Google that you've moved your site. How long does it take for that to be taken into account?
Actually, fairly quickly. I haven't actually, typically tested. You're actually doing it live. You're actually, you're putting it in there, and you are, when you are actually, Google actually, Google right at that time, they look to see and check to see that redirect is in place. And then if it's not in place, then then it will not, if the redirect's not in place, or you lose that redirect, it will, it won't be verified anymore in that change of address. It really does come down to them, how long it takes them to crawl the site, and your crawl budget and so forth. It is pretty quick for most sites. I would say within a week or two, it is it is taken care of really quickly. But I have not tested specifically how long it takes in that particular case.
Okay, thanks, Phil. I think we're going to wrap this up now. Thanks for joining us today. This has been the Oncrawl webinar, A Data-Driven Method to Effectively Migrate to HTTPS with Bill Hartzer. Thanks for joining us, and happy crawling.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me.